Well, thanks so much for joining. We're just going to take a couple minutes and let everybody enter into this virtual room. We're joined by a whole lot of people here today, a lot of interest in this topic. And so we look forward to sharing our discussion with you in just a moment. All right, well, we are going to get underway. We've got an action-packed conversation here today on the topic of offshore wind. My name is Wade Crowfoot, and I lead our Natural Resources Agency, and I'm actually coming at you from Sacramento, our agency headquarters. And this discussion is part of what we call our Secretary Speaker Series, where we bring to the public, to you all, topics of interest and importance. And offshore wind is obviously one of those topics that is moving forward in a lot of ways. And we thought it was a great opportunity to bring together leaders from across the state who are working on this issue in one way or the other and have a really open and hopefully compelling conversation about the future of offshore wind power in California. A few housekeeping notes. One is that we have a chat function, and my colleague Geeta Chandra, who did the work organizing our discussion, will be populating the chat with different links. So you see that Geeta has already shared a link to our Secretary Speaker Series, so you can see what other conversations that we've had. We are recording this discussion here today, and then this recording will go up on our website on the link that Geeta has provided. And then as we introduce different leaders here today, she'll likely provide links to their organizations or biographical information, just to be interactive. You'll also have an opportunity to ask questions, and you can do so at any point by clicking on the button on the bottom of your screen, Q&A, and getting a question. You don't have to wait until the end of our discussion. And my goal as our moderator is to bring those questions into the discussion. We'll hear from each of our panelists some opening thoughts, and then we'll have an interactive conversation. So let me, if I could, James, if we can move to what I call the Brady Bunch view, so you can see our panelists here today. I want to just briefly let you know who we're going to be talking to here today. So when you hear your name called, panelists, just give a wave so people can see you. So we have joining us David Hochschild, chair of our California Energy Commission. The CEC, as we know it, is driving a lot of our policy and work advancing offshore wind in California. We have Adam Stern, who's executive director of Offshore Wind California, which is comprised of businesses working in this sector. We have Eddie Ahn, who is executive director of Brightline Defense, an important environmental justice nonprofit across the state, and Eddie's very involved in this discussion. We have Jana Gagnon from the Blue Lake Rancheria. You may know the Blue Lake Rancheria is known across the state for its microgrid and some of the energy innovation that are happening at that sovereign tribal nation along the North Coast. We're going to be joined by Jeff Hoonerlock, who's the district representative and operating engineers local number 3. He's also the secretary treasurer for the Building and Construction Trades Council of Humboldt and Del Norte counties. We're also joined from a little bit south of us by Melissa James, who leads as president and CEO of REACH, which is a regional economic impact organization on California's Central Coast, focused on good paying jobs and economic prosperity in that region. And then we have Kristen Hislop, who comes to us from the Environmental Defense Center, focused on protecting and enhancing the local environment. And then a little bit later, we're going to be joined by Senator John Laird, who actually used to be secretary of our agency. And John, or Senator Laird, has been a champion of offshore wind. So we'll get the legislative perspective from him as well. So once again, if you have questions, you can ask them in the Q&A button, and do monitor the chat for links. So let's get underway. David, we're joined by, almost 500 people right now in this discussion. And one of the things I've shared with you is we might have some experts on this topic who live this from day to day, or maybe involved in an organization solely working on this. But we have a lot of people that are coming to this conversation without much understanding of offshore wind and how it plugs into what we're doing in California. So if you would, David, give us the high level, a little bit of the 101 of offshore wind power. Why are we considering in California? Where are we considering it? and generally where we stand.
Well, thank you so much, Secretary Crowfoot, and good afternoon, friends. Good to be with you. So I've been in the renewable energy field for 23 years, and in my judgment, after rooftop solar, offshore wind is the lowest impact form of electric generation in the world. What we're doing in California really is taking advantage of the fact we're a coastal state, over 800-mile coastline, and we've identified these two zones, 583 square miles altogether, off the central coast, Morro Bay, and the north coast off Humboldt, where we're going to be putting offshore wind. And just to give you a sense of the scale, these turbines, one rotation of an offshore wind turbine powers a house for a day. So incredible resource. And of the family of marine energy generation technologies, which includes tidal and wave power, offshore wind is by far the most mature. So, and this is an area where we're way behind where Europe is. They're adding over 5 gigawatts of offshore wind a year. Denmark, for example, has 500 turbines in place, and they're getting half their power from wind now. So we have a lot to learn from our partners in Europe. And part of what's going on is that we are expanding rapidly the amount of electricity we consume. We're seeing the electrification of almost everything happen in California. That's a key part of our climate strategy. We're adding over 1,000 electric vehicles a day to the roads in California. We basically need to triple clean energy generation by 2045. So this is a really important part of that. One thing that makes this really attractive is that the resource is amazing. And offshore wind is a much more powerful and reliable resource than wind on land. So capacity factor, that's the hours of the day where the turbines are spinning, on land is in the 35 to 40% range. Offshore is closer to 55%. And it's highly aligned with the hours of the day where we need power the most. So it's late afternoon, early evenings when solar is coming down. One of the things we got to remember, in addition to supporting electric reliability, is that 40% of our gas fleet in California is in low-income and disadvantaged communities. And to ultimately shut down those polluting power plants, we have to have clean alternatives. So the zones we've identified for offshore wind begin at 20 miles offshore and extend to 30. So they're quite far off, which reduces avian impacts and visual impacts. And the lease sale just happened on December 6th. So now we have 5 lease winners. And now we're really in the period of what I would call the great implementation and getting this done right, moving all the pieces forward so that we not only get offshore wind built, but we do it the right way and we attract in-state manufacturing.
David, thank you so much. Now, I understand that this technology may be a little bit different than offshore wind in places with shallower water. So if you're talking 20 miles out, I think that's pretty deep off the continental shelf. So you've talked about floating. Can you just talk a little bit about this technology?
Yeah, so it's actually not that complicated. It's sort of similar to how oil rigs are set up. The structure is a triangular base with a ballast. It's connected to the seafloor by 3 high tension cables. I've had the opportunity to see the largest floating wind project in the world, which is in Scotland, in fact, just off the coast from Donald Trump's golf course. And then there's another one I saw in Portugal. The structure basically looks as if it's fixed. You can't tell it's a floating structure because it's under tension. But the advantage is you can do this in quite deep water and in quite high seas. So that's what we're going to be doing. And it does open up new areas that previously were not available until the floating structure got developed.
That's
and
really
by the way, I should say, one other thing, the governor and the legislature tasked the Energy Commission earlier this year with setting the statewide goal. We had a very lengthy deliberation with a lot of stakeholder engagement and ended up setting the statewide goal at 25 gigawatts by 2045 and up to 5 gigawatts by 2030. For context, our peak load in the state of California today is about 52 gigawatts. So it's a really significant milestone.
Wow. So upwards, I mean, a big slice of the pie chart of California's future energy could be offshore wind. And David, I know we're involved in an important process to better understand what impacts could exist environmentally or economically on our fishing communities. I want to get back to that a little bit later, and I know Kristen will have some things to share there. But it's been a remarkable movement, and it seems like there's good alignment between the president and the governor on this. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the president's a big believer in this. He's, I think, installed an outstanding leadership team at the agency that runs this for the federal government, which is the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. They moved with great speed and diligence to get the lease sale done. It's certainly our hope to advance another lease sale before the end of the Biden administration's first term. And the governor as well is super committed on this. One thing I would say, many of you may have heard about some of the early fits and starts on the East Coast with offshore wind. Some of the projects that became the most controversial were controversial because they're very close to shore, 2 and 3 miles out. The zones we're talking about here don't even begin until 20 miles. So AV impacts and visual impacts are really, really, really diminished as a consequence of that.
David, thanks so much. Let's bring in Adam Stern to the conversation. As I mentioned before, Adam leads Offshore Wind California, which is an association of businesses, companies working on this. And Adam, I'm interested to know from your members' perspective, just, how promising is this in California? Is this a pipe dream? Is this happening from your perspective? What do we need to understand around the growth of this market?
Well, thank you, Secretary Crowfoot, and just delighted to have a chance to speak to your audience here. It's happening. This is one of the biggest opportunities we have to embrace the renewable energy future for California. And with the successful execution of the lease auction that happened last month, we now have 5 leaseholders. These are companies that have invested $150 million each in order to have the right to proceed with a process to develop offshore wind projects. The powerful winds bring a new source of energy into California's grid, as Chair Hochschild said, exactly in the seasons and the time when we need it. But in order to build on this momentum, and 2022 was an extraordinary year of achievement from the perspective of our industry and our member companies, we need to double down, I'd say even triple down on the pace of progress on about 6 separate work streams. And I'm just going to itemize them quickly here. Permitting. We need to navigate the complexity of the CEQA and NEPA rules. Those are the state and federal environmental regulations, and develop a roadmap that brings efficiencies while at the same time protecting our marine resources and coastal resources that we all care so much about here in California. On ports, we need a multi-port strategy to manufacture and assemble these offshore wind turbines and towers. And that will mean infrastructure investments both on the North Coast and on the Central Coast. Third, on procurement, we need a route to market. We need to be able, the companies that are prepared to invest literally billions of dollars to build the projects need a way to sell the power. And the California Public Utilities Commission is now beginning deliberations on how best to do that. On transmission, the California Independent System Operator, which manages the grid for the state, is now starting to do transmission planning to factor in the needs for offshore wind. Fortunately, there actually are some resources available on the Central Coast that will need to be built out. And on the North Coast, we've got a lot of work to do there to bring the power to shore and feed it into the grid. Fifth, workforce and supply chain development is a critical aspect. There's the potential here to develop tens of thousands of jobs if we do this right, not only for the needs in California, but we can become a global hub for the world in offshore wind. And finally, as Chair Hochschild mentioned, we need to move quickly to develop siting plans for the next set of call areas. The call areas, wind energy areas that were approved recently only allow for roughly 5 gigawatts of power. And we, as Chair Hochschild mentioned, we need to go to 25. So there are some planning areas off Mendocino and Del Norte that offer the opportunity for further investigation, potentially having a second auction, hopefully within the next 2 years, as Chair Hochschild mentioned. One key thing I just wanted to mention, Secretary, is it's critical that all of the constituencies that are represented on this call are part of this discussion. And the state agencies are doing a fabulous job creating opportunities for engagement. And we, representing industry, look forward to being part of that conversation.
Hey, thanks, Adam. Yeah, and we really work to get a broad array of perspectives. One perspective that we don't have represented on the panel, so I want to be sure to address potential concerns, is the fishing industry, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. But it really has been, from my perspective, a robust process to allow for all manner of input. One of the first questions we got was about jobs. Just when are these jobs going to materialize? So you have these different work streams, and it sounds complicated, and of course it is. I think we're all excited about the potential, but we know we have to build out those transmission lines. We have to ensure that our ports can handle this. That means a bunch of jobs. And I know our colleague Jeff is going to talk about this a little bit later, but Adam, what's the broad time frame from your perspective that this, that if we hit our targets, offshore wind will come online when?
Yeah, so the estimates are roughly by the end of this decade, or 2030, or the first projections of when offshore wind would become tangible, and you would potentially see wind turbines, as you said, 20 miles out, spinning and generating clean energy for our state. But in the build up to that, in order to get there, there has to be a tremendous amount of investment in infrastructure to build the assembly, to manufacture the blades, to build the cables. And all of this needs to be developed in what we might refer to as a giant Gantt chart that has to be ready to go, so that when the projects are approved, when the other aspects of planning are conducted in areas like procurement and transmission, we actually have the projects ready in the water. There's a variety of studies, including a new one that was just released today by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, which lays out a whole set of pathways for this to happen. I think the governor's office of Business and Economic Development, or GoBiz, has an important role here to play in charting this out. Our industry couldn't be more excited to be part of this process, but it needs to be accelerated at all levels of state and federal government if it's going to become real.
Adam, thanks so much. I want to bring Eddie on into the conversation. And as I mentioned, Eddie leads Brightline Defense. And Eddie, if you look at history in California, but really most places, some of the most negative impacts of energy generation and use have been centered in underserved communities of color. And likewise, the benefits generated by energy have not been experienced in those communities. So I'm really glad that you're helping lead the way in this conversation. I'm interested to know sort of what brings you to the work, and what brings Brightline Defense to the work, and what do you want to make sure gets done in this very complicated but important process that Adam laid out.
Thanks, Secretary Crowfoot. And again, Eddie On of an environmental justice nonprofit called Brightline. And part to answer your question is thinking through, for instance, the direct services, the actual programs that usually should accompany a development like this. And for instance, Brightline runs a job training program, as well as air quality monitoring programs that look at pollution sources and how to create job pathways to things like clean energy. And so for us, when we think about, building these projects at scale and creating enormous developments in areas that, historically have, not necessarily been part of a conversation. I think Janet Gagnon, I've heard speak repeatedly and very convincingly about the boom bust struggles, for instance, in the Humboldt region, but making sure that the region can share in the economic development benefits equitably is really important. So that's why Brightline, in addition to our direct services, which inform our policy work, we do a lot of the policy work itself. And it ranges from things like making sure that local hiring is part of the discussion, or targeted hire, to channel, more specifically, a percentage of these jobs toward local underemployed, unemployed communities, toward particular tribes, is going to be really important with the conversation moving forward. Also making sure that when we talk about community benefits for each region, either in the North Coast or Central Coast, and that they're integrated and essentially giving back to the communities in which these developments will impact, will be really important. And just acknowledge, of course, there are other conversations ongoing that you see on the East Coast. For instance, fisheries and environmental NGOs have really worked through a lot of their issues in terms of making sure that there's, for instance, mitigation funds set up, as well as environmental monitoring on these projects to make sure that the very legitimate marine conservation impacts that may happen around something like offshore wind are addressed. And just more generally thinking through that, when we create these funds, making sure that the communities included will be part of the work moving forward.
And what's your take on the public engagement to date? I know one area of improvement for government and state government is really engaging impacted communities and interested folks early in the process. What's your take, and what do we need? What should we remember moving forward, given a lot of decisions are in front of us?
I think just to take a step back for a moment, that the window of opportunity is really now. Right now, we're seeing an alignment of government agencies, local, state, federal, in trying to even plan and make this development possible. And who knows, we may have a change in federal administration which will drastically change the picture in 2 years. But just understanding that BOEM has been a good partner overall in trying to drive this conversation forward to make improvements to the bidding credit structure. Brightline, as an equity advocate, always believes that more can be done. But at least that, when we're integrating things like community benefits in that auction structure moving forward, that will happen is going to be really key. And so, the state agencies can be helpful in also driving the community benefits discussion in particular. And we've seen real leadership from the California Energy Commission in this regard. And even more recently, there have been trips established to the Humboldt region to explore the area. We're hoping in 2023, there will be more trips to the Central Coast as well to keep on making sure that this ball is moving forward.
Thanks so much, Eddie. Look forward to more conversation in a little bit. I want to introduce Jana Gagnon, who is Energy Director at Blue Lake Rancheria on the North Coast. Jana, some may not know that your rancheria, which is of course a sovereign government, has its own energy microgrid. And I've got a friend who I've had from childhood that actually lives in Blue Lake. And he said your energy grid was a savior for his family during the recent power outages. He actually went and charged his car and his phones and everything. So first of all, thank you for your leadership and partnership with the CEC getting that microgrid. It's important to note that there's a number of perspectives held by tribal governments on offshore wind. And asking you to share your thoughts from Blue Lake Rancheria, we want to acknowledge that there are different perspectives from different tribal governments. That being said, give us a sense of why you're engaged and why your tribal government is engaged and how you're engaged in offshore wind.
Yeah, thank you, Secretary Crowfoot. And I think the microgrids that the Blue Lake Rancheria tribal government has developed would only be possible because of the partnership with the state of California. And so it's an example of what we can do when tribal and state governments with our federal counterparts leverage the strengths of each to affect these changes. The reason that we're involved in offshore wind is because we really view it as an industry cluster. So there's wind energy development, there's port development, transmission grid upgrades, supply chain and workforce developments, including in-demand careers such as environmental data and monitoring, and ancillary infrastructure overlaps such as broadband, new housing, healthcare, childcare services, et cetera. As you said, I do not speak for the 109 tribal nations in California, nor the dozens of non-federally recognized tribes in California, but I will say that the nations that I've heard from are engaging in offshore wind to varying degrees, and most of these comments are from Blue Lake Rancheria's perspective. And it depends on other priorities, proximity to the likely build out areas and the new electrical transmission corridors, their interests in each of these kind of subcomponents of this industry cluster. But as Eddie mentioned, the lens of past exploitation of tribal areas and other rural areas for resource extraction is really part of the starting point for tribal state partnerships around offshore wind. So gold rush, land rush, genocides, creation of reservations and rancherias, timber rush, cannabis issues, the list goes on. And what they've resulted in is real harms, missing and murdered Indigenous people, environmental destruction. And this is a real backdrop to how this new industry no matter how clean, no matter how essential, is viewed. So with that lens in place, you know, the productive wind areas in Southern Oregon and Northern California are generally in areas where there isn't the onshore load, use of electricity or transmission to absorb the electrons. So we can think of these areas as host communities where some of the benefits will be local and some will be exported. And the other key component to tribal partnerships and why we're involved is to hopefully do better this time. We want to make sure that tribal governments have the capacity and the early and frequent meaningful engagement to understand and deploy their priorities within this new industry cluster. And this is a new industry that often is coming into these regions, and it's the first new industry in half a century. So the capacity to engage, the capacity to do permitting, all of those kinds of details around this has somewhat eroded over the last decades. And so we need to rebuild that as we accelerate, to Adam's point, this build out for the climate benefits and the economic and environmental benefits we can achieve. And I guess my last point will be that in most tribal cases, energy equity is needed. So we firmly believe that offshore wind can be a catalyst not seen since rural electrification in the 1930s to affect electrical cleanliness and reliability upgrades for tribes and other rural areas. Improvements that can happen either directly connected with the offshore wind systems or investments made in parallel when these wind enabling projects like new transmission are built, right? So we have an opportunity here to move at the speed of trust and at the speed of which we need to deploy this. But if we really iterate on it well, I think that the opportunity exists to right some of these past inequities around energy deployment, clean up some of the pollution in our communities, and really make the strong value proposition that the clean energy transition is exactly the path we need to go down. So I'll leave it there. Thanks so much.
Jana, thank you. And I'll just reemphasize the point you made, which is, you know, the commitment that we have to this early, often meaningful engagement. For us, it's consultation. It's government to government consultation between two governments. Do you think, I mean, just an honest question, do you think that message is being made to the wind developers, those members of Adams Association? You know, clearly, I hope California is among the national leaders in really committing to this. And I want to make sure that companies coming here know that. Any thoughts you have in terms of how it's going and where we could play an even stronger role, perhaps?
I want to thank the state and particularly the state agencies that signed the letter in the midst of the BOEM auction to really put forward the fact that we expect developers to come to these regions with the mindset of partnership and investment, and not just, you know, doing more than where their sort of individual box ends. This is why the microgrids have been so successful, because each of these private companies have come to the table and done more than what their contracts say on paper. And I think the state has been a clear partner in that. And there's always more engagement we can do. But in terms of the state tribal engagement around offshore wind, I think it's off to a fantastic start. The need now is for identifying resources to make sure that tribal governments, their staff, have the capacity to engage in adaptive management, regional steering committees with state and federal partners, you know, over the 50 to 100-year lifetime of this new industry. So
right.
I think it's off to a great start, and the state is, I've never seen anything like it. Like over the last 5 years with the leadership in the California Energy Commission, California Public Utilities Commission, the Natural Resources Agency, and others, this is a new era of tribal state partnership that we haven't seen, I think, before. And it's a testament to the leaders that are on this panel and others that's where that's the starting point for this new industry. And I think it's going to make a lot of difference in the way it gets rolled out.
Wade, with your permission, I just wanted to recognize Jana and her incredible team. The picture you see behind her is one of the 8 tribal microgrids, clean energy microgrids that the Energy Commission has funded. And that, Jana, I don't know if you could just share briefly the story of what just happened with the outage, but this is a great example of tribal leadership in clean energy.
Yeah. Well, and I was mentioning that local residents, not associated with the Rancheria, were able to go to the Rancheria, that microgrid, and plug in when they had long power outages. So that's a great big deal.
Yeah, and can I just say one other thing about that? Offshore wind actually in our region has the potential to reduce our reliance on the single point of failure that was in play that happened during the earthquake. Our natural gas plant that basically powers the whole region, except for microgrids like these, and they're very few, that went down immediately in the earthquake and power was out around the county. And so offshore wind allows us for that redundancy and resiliency upgrade that, again, at the megawatt and maybe gigawatt scale, that there's no other clear answer for, but this could do it.
Got it. Jana, thank you. I want to bring in Jeff Hoonerlock to the conversation now. Jeff is a district representative of Operating Engineers Local 3, which I understand is the largest construction trades local in the US with 37,000 members across 4 states. He's also the Secretary Treasurer for the Building and Construction Trades Council of Humboldt and Del Norte. And Jeff, as you know, this Q&A is coming in that shall integrate into the conversation. A lot of question about jobs. So glad to have you here. Glad to have you leading and making sure that that's one central priority of this whole program. Give us a sense of how you're engaged and why you're engaged with the Construction Trades Council in this conversation.
Thank you, Secretary Crowfoot. Yeah, labor's engaged. I'm engaged, really because of the size and the magnitude of this awesome project. I want to just acknowledge that here locally, our building trades, local building trades, has 16 affiliated trades, which is huge. Our state building trades, it has 14 affiliated trades. So here in Humboldt County, the amount of jobs that we're looking at is obviously going to conduce for what the size and scale is of this project, not just here in Humboldt, but all the way here on the West Coast of California for the trades. It's not for the trades. It's actually for the local people that we want to put to work. We want to grow the membership. If we need 50 welders here in Humboldt County, we want to make sure that there's 50 welders here, at least that attempt to get them here trained for this type of project. We ask, it's a big question because it's a new industry. How many jobs are we talking about, And if we can say, oh, this or oh, that, but really, I think at the end of the day, by 2030, we're talking about thousands of jobs. And by 2045, later on in it, Adam said it perfectly, tens of thousands of jobs happening here on the West Coast. And that is all the way from, the port development, supply chain, and the infrastructure, to upgraded transmission. It's not just here in Humboldt. It's all the way on the West Coast here, and even probably stemming into Oregon and Washington also. And we're actively working with those 2 states also on, hey, what are we going to do about job creation and making sure that we're putting our local folks to work all the way up and down the West Coast.
Jeff, thank you so much. Now talk to me about job opportunities. People may not know exactly how the trades works. And for folks that, might be up there in the North Coast or the Central Coast, how do these jobs get accessed over time?
So we have we start with a pre-apprenticeship program, and we're actually partnering with Cal Poly here on our trades. It's through the National Building Trades. And so people go to this pre-apprenticeship, they actually get paid to go to it. And then that gives them a front row seat to get into the real apprenticeship program. Every single one of the trades I spoke about, and I'm speaking, operating engineers, carpenters, laborers, sheet metal workers, all of these trades. I mean, there's a big list if you go to the state building trades, and you can see all the different trades. There's 14 affiliated at the state level and 16 here. But with that said, every single one of these trades have apprenticeship programs. And every single one of these trades want to grow their program with local people. We don't want to bring people from Sacramento. I mean, it's going to happen. I mean, because we're not going to be able to fill the jobs, every single job here locally, but we want to make that attempt to as hard as we can to bring in local people. So a while back last year, I actually have taken some of before the lease auction. It was a year ago before that. We have taken, several of these offshore wind developers, international companies. Cal Poly was there. It was really great to take them to our local training center, but it's in Sacramento. And, that's where we have, it's just state of the art, multi-million-dollar and probably close to $1 billion facility, with 20 cranes and all of the stuff we do, but we're ready here in Sacramento and here locally to come together with the community and whatever we have to do to build our training centers up to fit the offshore wind needs. We already feel that at least the operating engineers that were there, we just have to have some involvement and engagement with these offshore wind developers and port developers, development folks that had won the leases, and we want to engage more with them, which we already are.
That's great. I mean, I'm really excited. So you're talking careers, not just jobs, but getting more people into these careers, good paying jobs, and a lot of them. We talked at the top of the discussion just about what has to be built and actually put in place for this industry to take off, for this technology to work. And it's going to translate, as you said, into thousands, tens of thousands of jobs over the next decade and decades. This is a great time to bring Melissa James into the conversation. Melissa is president and CEO of an organization called REACH, which is an economic development organization in the Central Coast. And Melissa, we just talked to Jeff about jobs and economic development. I'm interested in a little bit from you, first of all, and when we talk about Central Coast, just locate that region for us. So what sort of cities and counties are we talking about? And then also, how are your communities that you interact with feeling right now about the potential of offshore wind, and how are you engaging them?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks so much for hosting this conversation. I know there's been such a big, push at the state level with all the interagency coordination to develop out this brand new industry. And I would say on the Central Coast, it's really parallel to that. There's a lot of interagency and cross-sector collaboration happening around offshore wind on the Central Coast. So just by way of background, the Central Coast and the communities that we represent here at REACH are San Luis Obispo and Santa Barbara counties. So the Central Coast can be seen broadly as kind of Ventura to Santa Cruz. We're kind of the Central Coast here as we're talking about the Morro Bay wind energy area. And I would say, the conversation in this last year has really heated up with the designation of the wind energy areas and certainly the lease auction that has taken place. But it's been a conversation that has been underway for several years with a lot of our elected leadership and our kind of community leaders realizing the potential that offshore wind represents. I think it's something that some folks might not know about the Central Coast is we are the host of the state's last operating nuclear power plant, which had been set to decommission in 2024 and 2025, and now has been pushed out for a larger extension until 2030. That matters because some of the work that we're doing at REACH to think about our economic future was really catalyzed around the energy transition and the impact of the loss of Diablo as our largest private sector employer and what that would mean for our community. And what's happened, I would say, for the better part of the last 4 years is the Central Coast has really embraced and adopted kind of clean tech innovation, and the innovation around offshore wind as a really important kind of component of our economic future. So we, over the course of the last couple of years, have started to kind of do our homework and really understand what this might mean for our region and how we can be a part of kind of building out this energy future. We did an economic impact analysis back in 2021. There's been a lot of conversation already around the jobs and economic potential, but we were able to quantify very specifically for the 3 gigawatts that are going to be built off the coast of Morro Bay, that it is about 650 good paying jobs, average at 90,000 each. And then there's also, big, jobs and investments in some of the infrastructure that needs to be developed to support it. So think many thousands more in construction jobs. So when you think about the clean energy potential and you think about the economic potential, there's a lot there that, our community is really embracing. And then what it really comes down to for us next, because we know why it's important, we know what, it is we're talking about. Now we know where it's going to take place, off of Humboldt and off of the Central Coast. And as of, the end of the year, we know who the 5 companies are that are going to be partnering with the state and our local communities to develop out the offshore wind industry. So now the question is really turning for us into the how. How is it going to be built out? How are local communities like the Central Coast and Humboldt going to be a part of benefiting from what this looks like? We're really excited that we're seeing, a big priority from both our federal government and the state government to prioritize community benefits in some of the leasing. And we think that, we're really advocating for that to continue through the siting of infrastructure to the development of training programs for what that looks like into the future. And just to address kind of the how conversation on the Central Coast, just at the end of December, we released a community project for a waterfront infrastructure feasibility study with SLO and Santa Barbara counties and Morro Bay partnering with us on that study. And that study was addressing for us kind of where and how could offshore wind infrastructure be either enhanced or developed on the Central Coast? Because none of the jobs and opportunities and benefits will exist on the Central Coast if we're not smart about planning for the infrastructure that's needed. So we see that there's kind of a parallel happening with a lot of focus and priority at the state level. We're really organizing and prioritizing and working on the community level to say, how can we be a part of this future and what does that look like? And really an important nexus to marry those things up. And the other piece that I want to make sure that I communicate, as you kind of noted, Secretary Crowfoot, for some of the perspectives that aren't on this call, that doing the conversation around the impacts to the fishing industry and making sure we're engaging all of our tribal communities is a very important part of the way the conversation is taking place on the Central Coast. That it really has to be an all of community process and partnership with government, with industry, but then these communities on the Central Coast being a part of shaping what it looks like into the future.
Yeah, and really making sure we avoid this paradigm of winners and losers. So speaking of the Central Coast, we're joined by Senator John Laird, who I said was coming on. He's obviously a key leader. And in a moment, Senator, I'm going to ask you for a perspective from the legislature. But before we do, there's one important voice we haven't heard from yet, and that's Kristen Hislop, who works for the Environmental Defense Center, which is an organization, environmental NGO, really ensuring that we're protecting our coastline, our oceans, et cetera. And I'm getting some questions in the Q&A about just what are the environmental impacts and the aquatic impacts of offshore wind and how are we studying that? So Kristen, I don't want to make you answer all those, but I want to start to bring that into the conversation as well. Just give me a sense of why EDC is involved in this discussion.
Great, thank you so much. I will try to hit some of those questions I saw as they came in. But First, I want to just say that the Environmental Defense Center, we're a nonprofit based in Santa Barbara. And since the organization was founded in 1977, one of our main focus areas has been supporting the transition away from fossil fuels to renewable energy. So our top line kind of view of responsible offshore wind development is positive, and we're optimistic that offshore wind can provide an opportunity for California to fight climate change, reduce air pollution, and improve energy reliability. At the same time, this technology needs to be developed in a responsible manner with minimal environmental impacts and robust community engagement, which we've heard a bit about so far today. So some of those environmental impacts could be potential displacement of marine species such as marine mammals. They might try to avoid the area, therefore moving away from important migration areas or feeding grounds. There could be direct impacts, collisions for birds. We know that's an issue on shore as well. So there's a lot of different impacts we're looking at, but I'm going to try to go over really the big picture of that. So our focus at EDC is local to the Central Coast, but we work very closely with groups up and down the coast to coordinate and communicate on all things offshore wind. So when building our view of offshore wind, again, climate change is at top of mind, and EDC, or Environmental Defense Center, and our partners have been elevating this issue for decades. We know that warming temperatures are having direct impacts on biodiversity loss. An Audubon study showed that we could lose a staggering 389 species of birds in North America if warming reaches 3 degrees. So we know we need to address that. The how is kind of where we are right now. We've also seen ocean warming events contribute to habitat loss and shifting ranges along our California coast, and this list goes on. So while we of course need to find solutions to end our reliance on fossil fuels, we must also do so with a precautionary approach that needs to consider and address all the ways that this new industrial activity in the ocean may contribute to habitat and biodiversity loss. So we need to balance our needs to address climate change and not create more problems in the ocean and along the coast. And so I'd like to just highlight a few key points that my colleagues and I have been elevating since this conversation really got started about 6 years ago. The first being that we need to use species and habitat data to site offshore wind projects, not only in areas that are optimal for wind speeds and other technical reasons, but that will also avoid negative impacts to species and habitats. So that's, as we're talking about all of these different impacts that could occur, one of the things that we can do to avoid those impacts is by making sure that these projects end up in the right place. We don't want to see projects inadvertently impact migrating whales, birds and bats, sea turtles, sharks, fishes, and other animals that rely on the California coast. We genuinely want to see these projects succeed in our shared goal of protecting biodiversity. So in order to accomplish this, we must have a coordinated development of alternatives to first avoid, then minimize, and then mitigate significant impacts. So considering this, we are very pleased, as was mentioned earlier, that this floating technology is able to push projects 20 plus miles from shore. Many environmental groups are very concerned about projects closer to shore, saying in or near state waters going out to 3 miles. Many species have near shore affinity, which means that coastal waters are incredibly important to them. And thus projects near the coast are likely to have significant negative environmental impacts. And this kind of avoidance structure translates to onshore development as well. We've heard about ports, and there's transmission and all sorts of things that are going to impact the environment along the coast and also coastal communities. And then second, when evaluating impacts of offshore wind, we must consider reasonably foreseeable and cumulative impacts. Cumulative meaning we're not just looking at one turbine in one location or one project. We're looking up and down the coast because things like migrating whales use the entire coastline. And third, in order for offshore wind to be a success story in California, robust public engagement is critical. And we've worked to maintain an open dialogue with developers and regulatory agencies to ensure that environmental protections are top of mind. And we support the voices you've heard so far today that speak to the importance of environmental justice through community benefit agreements, communications plans as required by lease agreements, and other tribal and stakeholder engagement plans. And we're really grateful for the engagement so far between environmental groups and the Energy Commission, Coastal Commission, and Ocean Protection Council. And finally, we have highlighted the importance of addressing data gaps and creating a solid plan to incorporating ongoing and future scientific studies into all phases of project development. So I saw a question about what are going to be the impacts of seismic surveys on marine mammals. And what we really need to do, there's a whole lot of questions like that. So what we really need to do is collaborate with scientists and NGOs, et cetera, to identify those questions and how to best answer them. And one way to accomplish this is by creating a West Coast collaboration that's similar to one on the East Coast called the Regional Wildlife Scientific Collaboration, which is often referred to as RWSC. And that includes federal and state agencies, scientists, environmental NGOs, and the industry. And so together, such a collaboration can provide scientific recommendations for data collection. Very important, we need to know what's out there, seasonal differences in species and whatnot. We need to have strong monitoring protocols. We need to fill data gaps and create research recommendations and make sure that management of offshore wind data, so the information being collected by the various entities that are working out there, is available in a publicly available database. So that's something, this idea of a collaboration is really important to us. There's a lot more detail, and I know there's more questions, but I will leave it at that.
Kristen, thanks so much. And we definitely want to follow up with you on developing such a collaboration. I have the benefit of, or the honor of, leading our Ocean Protection Council, and a lot of our funding is really meant to fill in those data gaps. And want to just thank you and other environmental advocates for ensuring that as we move forward with offshore wind, which is so important to our clean energy goals, we do it in a way that really avoids and minimizes impacts, and not only environmental impacts, but economic impacts for those that rely on the ocean, including our fishing communities. Senator Laird, you are joining a conversation that includes everyone from the California Energy Commission to regional leaders in the North Coast and on the Central Coast. It's important in these conversations that we have to always get legislative leaders' perspective, because in many ways we're implementing the laws that you all set forth. So I'm interested in both your personal perspective in terms of where we stand on offshore wind and what you're doing, as well as the legislative perspective that you can bring into this conversation. So welcome.
Thank you. And I have the unique perspective in that I was sitting in your chair for 8 years, and so and headed the Ocean Protection Council and did things there. And believe me, when I sat in your chair, we had a really ramshackle office building. So I'm jealous of that view and that nice office that you have there right now. I apologize because I wasn't able to be here to hear the previous speakers, but I did hear both Melissa and Kristen, and I think it's a perfect takeoff to answer your question. But I think I would like to look back a little and then look forward, because I've had the statewide perspective and chaired the climate working group in the Senate last year, but at the same time, I represent one of the 2 districts that the offshore wind leases were made for. And looking back, the legislature approved Assembly Bill 525 the year before last to try to prioritize offshore wind, and it was really helpful in a number of ways. And I think the Central Coast District that I represent is an ideal way to look at what a transition is to moving ahead with renewables. I mean, we have 2 fossil fuel plants that are likely both moving to the largest battery storage plants and utilizing the transmission out of those. And the Diablo Canyon extension, I helped fashion that deal in a way that if there was going to be an extension, it would be just extended to the time that offshore wind was coming on, so that we could transition the transmission in that area to be able to use to the offshore wind. And it is really important, because if you look at, for example, the marine protected areas, that is science-based. It came out of a stakeholder process. I personally negotiated with the tribes to bring them in because they were in opposition and some of their concerns were not taken care of. And so it is really the message that we just heard about stakeholders is very important. And when we were doing the climate working group, we had 25 meetings last year, 12 senators, but the first 9 were with stakeholders. And 2 of the first ones, one was with the building trades, and then one was with environmental groups that were more mainstream. We did 2 separate ones with environmental justice groups. And the building trade said to us, nothing makes us crazier than the environmentalists supporting goals and then opposing every individual project to implement those goals. And when we got to the stakeholder meeting with the environmentalists, we brought that up, and somebody actually said, and probably didn't, we guaranteed confidentiality, but one person said they might have a point. And I think the offshore wind is at the heart of that debate, which is, how do we make sure through a science-based stakeholder process that we address all those issues in a clear way that allows us to go forward? Because if you look at what happened last September, we were just on the edge with the grid, and it was demand management. And for a few hours, it was the very battery storage I mentioned that actually produced, for those few hours, more power onto the grid that was clean than was coming out of the base load of Diablo Canyon. And so, and just as with wind, with battery storage, there are concerns about people around it because some of the incidents that happened, which is why I did something I don't usually do. I introduced a bill on the first day that is going to lead to safety standards on fire and other things, and maybe even protocols for releasing information with regard to battery storage, so that we can assure people that there's safety there while moving ahead with something that is a key part of our all of the above energy strategy. And so if you look at moving ahead, there are just a lot of specific issues, and I heard some of them just named. And for me, whose heart is in the environmental movement, when you look at mitigating the impacts to marine mammals and aviary species, it's like, it's my hope that we find the path that does the mitigation, but allows it to go ahead, but not short circuit what it is we have to do to mitigate, but make sure that we can get to a place that makes it workable. And there are really specific issues. I mean, I was talking to one legislator on the first day of session who said to me, well, everybody is saying that it's going to take 15 to 17 years to get offshore wind online. And I was like, who are you talking to? It is like, that is not it, but it is up to us to decide that we're negotiating with tribes and fisher people and everybody that is involved in a different way. And Melissa's, it's really Reach's study, so I was going to give Melissa full credit for it a minute ago. And that study really raises some port issues that are going to raise hackles among environmentalists, while drawing strong support from other stakeholders. Well, how do we, in a way that we have done with some of these other issues, deal with working it out? And you know, it seems like every port option has got some issue, and how do we not allow that to veto the project by what they are, but it really is implicit in us to work out the issues. The thing I'm hearing most from the industry right now, and some of the successful bidders, either directly or through other people, is that procurement is going to be one of the biggest issues that's going to allow this to go ahead or give the stability. And we have to figure out a way, if it's not in statute or not in process already, to make sure that those concerns are met, that they have the kind of confidence, whether it's with investors or actually developing it or whatever, that they can move ahead. And last year we started with a one-stop permitting at one point, and I think we still need to look at whatever is still necessary to make that happen, so that we are not just doing all these permitting processes in sequence. I was in Big Sur and the Monterey Peninsula and the Carmel Valley yesterday looking at storm damage, because I think my district it has to be the hardest hit. And the issue of the replacement of the Big Sur Bridge 5 years ago came up, and that bridge went down. and it cut off a 40-mile stretch and all the people that lived on it. And Caltrans normally takes 5 years to go through the design and financing and construct of a bridge. And that was done in 5 or 6 months, and Caltrans was ordering the steel before they had finished the design. They were just determined, with all those people cut off, that they were going to do it. And in some way, we have to have that same urgency with this without short-circuiting what all these stakeholder issues are. And so if you look forward, whether it's the procurement, how the port is done, how the transmission works, how we deal with the wildlife impacts, how we deal with some of the stakeholders that were named by the 2 previous speakers, we have to do that, but we have to do it with the urgency of we need to have this online, provided we can mitigate all those things. And it's one of those things that when we were, I am sure there's split opinions of people that are watching about the Diablo Canyon issue we dealt with last year, but I fought very hard for the Coastal Commission not to be overridden in their prerogatives, but that the trade-off would be that they do it in a fixed amount of time so there can be some assuredness that their issues will be addressed in a timely fashion. And I think there are very similar things here in a way of doing this. So, and if you, the one last thing to say is that last year, we made more progress on climate in the legislature than maybe since the year that AB 32 was enacted in 2006. But part of it was renewing and setting the goals without, and tremendous budget actions, without necessarily talking about where the energy was going to be developed to make sure that we met these goals. And this is one of those places. If we don't do this and we have to gin up electricity 10 times over the next period of time to meet our goals, and we've got transmission issues and lots of other issues, we are going to need to put big pieces in place that is just like this. And we can't have the public getting inured to the fact that they have to move to renewables and they have to move to electricity without us actually having the electricity. And it's like, I have the luxury of speaking from the Central Coast District of the 2. If you look at the Humboldt area, they have real transmission issues, and the way it takes us to get transmission online, it makes me nervous. And I have pledged to work with everyone to have a broader look than just the Central Coast in my district to figure out how we do what is necessary for transmission to make that work. And
Totally.
So we have a lot in front of us, and yet we have momentum. And I think the real issue is just making sure we have everybody at the table. And it's one of those things that I find we have to do around environmental issues or energy issues, which is, this is not a binary choice. This is not, yes, we do this, no, we don't. This is, yes, we do this, but how do we do this in a way that addresses the stakeholders and addresses the concerns, so everybody feels like they were at the table and that a fair shake was given to the concerns that they're expressing. So in my view, that's sort of where we are, and who knows how that fits into the legislative process.
Well,
which
listen,
could be the subject of an entire workshop all by itself.
we've just given a masterclass overview of some of the key challenges. And one takeaway I hear is, how do we get this done as quickly as climate change demands, but in a way that's actually inclusive and thoughtful and careful to avoid and mitigate impacts. And I just want to tell you that this remains a work in progress. You know, piece of candid feedback from our colleague, Mike Conroy, who helps lead the fishing communities, is feeling like the BOEM process to develop those call areas was not inclusive, and wants to ensure that as we're considering other call areas, that there be a more inclusive process. I think that's really important to bring up.
Yes, and I think that is important, and having dealt with the marine protected areas, which were very tumultuous in similar negotiations. I can see it, but at the same time, I heard a call for making the areas based on science. And obviously we want to do that, but for some of us, we want a Chumash National Marine Sanctuary, and we want to make sure that it lines up in the right way. And there's whole hosts of issues that don't necessarily lend themselves to this is the only thing in the world process. Let's figure out how to do it.
Fair point. I want to answer. We want to move into questions. Again, you can ask a question through the Q&A function. Just to answer a couple of basic ones. One is we are recording this discussion, and my colleague Geeta, who deserves credit for organizing this whole thing, will be sending out an email to those that RSVP'd, both with a hyperlink to this recording, but then also a copy of all of the helpful a chat that's occurring, including all of these web links. A lot of you have asked for the web links on this. Question back to David Hochschild. Question around, yes, offshore wind, but how is this guaranteeing that we're going to actually take down the dirtiest forms of energy generation? Put this into the broader context of how this fits into our 100% clean energy goal, because I don't think we really talk too much about that.
So I think, first of all, it's in the statute. We have to get to 100% clean energy by 2045. The governor signed legislation in September that accelerates the midterm target. So it's now 90% carbon free by 2035. But the paramount issue is reliability. As the senator noted, one thing we're doing that's helping a lot with that is energy storage. So in 2019, we had just over 200 megawatts of energy storage grid connected in California. Today, we have 4,500 megawatts, so a 22-fold increase in 3 years, en route to 15,000 megawatts by 2030. So I would say offshore wind coupled with storage is how we do that. And we're, like offshore wind, we're trying to attract back the manufacturing supply chain as we proceed. So those two things to me go hand in hand. I did want to just speak also to a point Janet Gagnon made earlier. You know, there's a chance to kind of flip the script. For a long time, we have imported fossil fuel power from other states, coal power, for many, many years in California. And we could actually be exporting offshore wind and bringing revenue into the state and jobs into the state. And I think that is another example of where you're seeing climate and industrial policy become increasingly intertwined. But we've got to do all these things at the same time. And I think, reliability, as we saw Senator Laird noted in September, is going to be paramount every single year. And offshore wind will be really helpful in building that out. Thanks,
David. Question for Jeff. Norman asks, for the folks working at fossil fuel sites in and around Santa Maria, which I think is in Santa Barbara County, what opportunities are available to them once their jobs go away? Can you link sort of coming jobs with jobs that may be lost as we phase out of fossil fuels? How realistic is that?
Well, thank you for the question. Yeah, I would say that, look, it's a transition. Also like plug and play, we know that we can't just plug in and do away with those jobs at the fossil fuel plants, so we're going to have to be well into not the future, but well into the offshore wind projects and going on before. So we have a place for these guys to go. The transition, I think anybody that wants to transition in over from the fossil fuel to the offshore wind, I think that it's not a hard transition. But again, we're talking about people with families, and we're talking about real careers, and we're talking about, having an opportunity that they can do something else, but the something else has to be happening first before we can transition them. So
yeah, that's right on. Andrea asked a question, and she leads the California Association of Harbor Masters and Port Captains. So big development has to happen at our ports, right, to actually build out and install this. Adam, what's your take? And I think that was one of the concurrent pathways that you said had to get underway. How's that going? And just interested if you or others want to jump in around if there's anything that we need to be doing that's not currently happening.
Sure, Secretary. There are a number of studies that are about to be released in the next few months that are going to give more visibility into the options for port development. So we'll be following those very closely. It's encouraging, though, that already Humboldt has announced a partnership with one of our member companies, Crowley, to develop some of the early assembly space. And similarly, there's a new initiative that the Port of Long Beach has begun to publicize of their interest. So there's movement, there are studies underway. The key in all of this is going to be integrating the findings of the studies and coming up with policy actions that can be, moved quickly. I just want to leave you with one last thought on this, though, on the broader picture, and Senator Laird's comments reminded me of it. California has this tremendous history of innovation, and we have been leaders in renewable energy. We're actually behind on offshore wind, but I believe if this group of stakeholders is at the table in every one of the discussions on the issues that I outlined, we can do this. This is something that is a once in a generation opportunity. Capitalize on the talent, the innovation, create the jobs, bring clean energy, address marine issues. And couldn't be more inspired by this discussion that you've hosted here, because this is something we can build and we can do it. And thank you for embracing the full community of stakeholders into this process.
Thanks so much. Hey, we're going to try a speed round. We're got about 5 minutes left, and I'm asking each of you for a sentence of what you want to make sure gets done so we can be successful. I think we all understand if this gets done right, we can be economically and environmentally successful, but there's a lot of things that have to land. So maybe in the order of presentation, just a sentence, which will be a challenging, or two, in terms of what do you want to make sure we get right. David.
Okay, it's okay if it doesn't have verbs. I would say procurement, manufacturing, transmission, workforce, port upgrades. So.
You've cheated, but you got it into one sentence, so I think we're good there. Adam.
I'll leave it to two: siting for new call areas and procurement strategy.
Got it. Eddie from Brightline Defense.
Community benefits and energy equity package that's agreed upon between the developers, state government agencies, and local communities.
Thank you. Jana from the Blue Lake Rancheria.
A focus on transmission build-outs that are equitable and address other needs besides offshore wind. So a big, bold goal there would be great. And also that we have data transparency through collaborative public-private research entities that we know are in motion now. It's important.
Excellent. Short paragraph there. Helpful. Jeff.
Yeah, to include in all the PLAs, high roads training and labor standards and transmission.
Really excited by your vision. Thank you for being part of this. Over to Melissa.
I'd say strong engagement with the communities that are adjacent to the wind energy areas, Humboldt and Morro Bay, and priority of investment in infrastructure and transition of the jobs away from the old energy paradigm into the new one.
Yes, and you've gotten some Q&A. Please hold us accountable for ensuring that we're really focused on how this is going to benefit the Central Coast regionally and its economy. Kristen.
Definitely support for Jana's data transparency, but also strong collaboration for science-based policies to avoid significant environmental impacts.
Excellent. Thank you. And John Laird, quite fittingly, last word.
Yeah, it needs to be the last. I need to run over to the Senate floor session that's gaveling down. My sentence would be, we need to do this. And so everybody needs to know what it is they want that we build into the solution so we get this done, meeting all the needs that we've just heard from.
Excellent. Thank you so much for joining us, and good luck today as you do your work. And thanks everyone for joining us. We've had over 500 people join this conversation. And of course, this is just one more step in the dialogue around how we bring offshore wind to California and do it in the right way. So if you have questions or comments for us, please find us at the email that's on the screen. And once again, we will share a copy of the chat links as well as the video recording just as soon as it's ready here in the next couple of days. Finally, panelists, thank you. Thank you for joining us for the conversation. More importantly, thank you for the work that you're doing to make sure that we get this incredible opportunity right in California. That's all for now. Have a great day and have a great week. Take care.